Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Geithner, we welcome you here. I want to talk with you a little bit about the tax reform issue because, frankly, as I evaluate this budget, I don't find what I call tax reform in it. Now, there are some positive provisions, for example, the provision you referred to earlier about the R&D tax credit and so forth. But as I look at the budget, we have about $1.6 trillion of new taxes in the proposed budget over 10 years, but no real change in our tax system. And frankly, depending on whether the economic assumptions of this proposal are accurate, which I think they are significantly overstated, maybe at most, with the most aggressive economic projections that you've got, a $1 trillion reduction in the rate of growth of our debt over 10 years, which I think is far lower than what we need to be focusing on. My question is this. As you know, Senator Coburn and Senator Conrad and I served on the Fiscal Commission that made recommendations for tax reform. And although the budget that you are proposing contains, I think, over $300 billion of reduction of tax expenditures, it is said that you are following the pattern of the Fiscal Commission. That's very different from what the Fiscal Commission did, because the Fiscal Commission did much more than that, but the tax expenditure reduction that the Fiscal Commission proposed was utilized for rate reduction and for major reform of our tax system. The tax expenditure reductions that I see in the budget are being used to offset more spending, as I see it. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. Let me just compliment you first for the work you did in the committee, because I think you helped highlight the cost of existing tax expenditures, and you laid a path for bringing sensible changes to our tax system that involves lowering rates significantly, broad base, and raising revenue. The proposals you endorsed do raise substantial revenue over time, but in a way that, frankly, makes a lot of sense. Look, if you're going to make changes around the margin of the current tax system, you have less scope for fixing the broad set of problems our tax system prevents the economy today. What the budget does, as you said, makes a set of changes around the edges of the current tax system. I agree with many who say that realistically, it may make more sense to do comprehensive reform on the individual side and the corporate side rather than making these changes at the basic margin. If you do comprehensive reform, then you can lower rates, you can broaden the base, you can probably raise some revenues too in a way that's more acceptable to people, and you can clean up a system that's very complicated, very unfair now, and probably bad for economic growth. So that has a lot of merits, and we did not propose comprehensive reform on the individual side in this budget, but the President said in the State of the Union that we think that's something we're going to have to come to, and what we need to do is try to build a foundation in the Congress on alternative strategies to achieve that. But I admire the path you laid out in the Commission, and I think that's obviously a model. There's other models out there. I know Senator Wyden has.
Well, let me just interrupt and say, it seems to me to use $320+ billion of tax expenditures and end up with zero reform of the tax code, no rate reduction, and in fact, in my opinion, as I read the budget, no real spending restraint, is a huge mistake. It uses up a huge portion of our opportunity for true tax reform.
So can I just clarify one thing? In the proposals we set in the budget, we're proposing, as you said, to reduce this one tax expenditure that goes to the top 2% of Americans, and we suggest to devote that to helping pay for extending the AMT. So that is like using a tax expenditure reform to make possible lower rates for a substantial number of Americans. But I won't disagree with you that there are a lot of merit in taking a comprehensive approach, because you can do a lot of good things for simplicity, fairness, for growth, for efficiency, by looking at this comprehensively and trying to lower rates as you broaden the base.
Well, thank you. And I want to get into that further with you, but I'm running out of time, and I have one other question I really want to get out to you, and that is on the corporate side. Again, I don't see the kind of reform that I think we should have seen coming from the President. But one question I have is, as you know, the Commission recommended in our corporate reform, when we get to it, that in addition to rate reduction, that we adopt a territorial system for our country in our tax code, which most other nations are moving to now. Nothing from the White House has been said on this yet. I'd like you to share your opinion with us as to whether we should make that move.
Well, as I tried to say, and the President said in the State of the Union, we would like to work towards comprehensive corporate tax reform that lowers the rate, broadens the base, revenue neutral. As part of that, we will examine a range of options on the territorial side. The test for us is going to be, how do we make sure our system encourages rather than discourages investment in the United States? And when you look at territorial systems, you got to be very careful, not just so you're not losing hundreds of billion dollars in revenue, but you don't want to be reinforcing incentives and opportunities for companies to shift income and shift investment outside the United States. We could not justify, they cannot defend it. But we will look at a whole range of those options in the context of comprehensive reform. Can I just say one quick thing about what you said on the deficit reduction? The Commission laid out a comprehensive approach that would reduce the deficits, as the Commission estimated, to somewhat below 3% of GDP over the next 5 years or so. That was the task we gave the Commission. You guys met that, slightly overachieved on that task, although it hasn't been scored formally. This budget does achieve reduction in deficit, bring us down to 3% over the same time frame. You go a little further, which I commend you for. And that is a minimum necessary. I mean, we need to go beyond that over time, but that's a good place to start. And what the President does is lay out a comprehensive set of changes that achieve not just spending reduction, but a set of reforms that will help bring the deficits down too. And again, I emphasize this because, as you said, I think, you don't want those spending savings that we're going to have to deliver to go to sustain unaffordable tax expenditures, tax rates, tax preferences that only benefit a very small fraction of the economy and have other costs for everybody else. Everybody else pays higher taxes because of those expenditures. It's not a good way to make fiscal policy.
Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Senator Hatch. And Secretary, I'd like to go back to an issue that I think Senator Coburn covered with you. I had to step out of the room for a minute then, but it deals with the economic assumptions behind the President's budget. We're still working through all of this, but my understanding from the information I've seen at this point is that the economic assumptions used in developing this budget are about 10 or 12% higher than CBO's economic assumptions and about 20% higher than blue chip assumptions in the private sector. Is that your understanding as well?
No, but I think it's very important to discuss, and I'd like to come at it this way. We are assuming growth over the next 5 to 10 years that's significantly lower than the average recoveries of past recessions. So we're trying to be realistic and conservative.
But is comparing it to past recessions going to give you a real feel for what's going to happen in reality?
Well, I'll give you a bunch of other comparisons. If you look at the average of the members of the FOMC, their forecasts, we're sort of at the middle of those. Now, we are a little higher than CBO's, but that's in part because the way CBO has to make assumptions, they have to assume all the Bush tax cuts expire on schedule all at once together. And that would hurt growth in that period of time. So we don't make that assumption because we want to extend the middle-class tax cuts. So I think it's a little more balanced than you suggested. We think they have to be, they're actually quite realistic and quite conservative, but in the end, of course, it's CBO's estimates which will govern.
Well, let's just take CBO's. Would you agree that if we use the same assumptions that CBO put out in January as they evaluated the economy, if we just assume that their opinion hasn't changed since January, and those assumptions were used, would the $1.1 trillion of debt retirement or deficit or debt reduction that you see in this budget still exist?
Well, I agree with you, and you'll see this when CBO puts out their estimates. If CBO is to estimate the economic effect of our proposed policies, if enacted by Congress, on their assumptions about the underlying dynamics of the economy, they will show somewhat higher deficits than what are estimated in the President's budget, somewhat higher. Not dramatically higher, but somewhat higher.
Let me come at this from a little different perspective. Would you agree that there are approximately $1.6 trillion in tax increases in the proposed budget over 10 years?
I would, but I would draw your attention to the more than $3 trillion in tax cuts that are in the budget, because if you add up what we're doing for middle-class Americans on the business side, small businesses, they substantially outweigh those more modest tax changes that apply to just a limited number of the most fortunate Americans.
I think that might get us into a discussion as to whether a payment of the federal government to an individual is a tax cut. But I understand the way that
The big difference is just what assumptions you make about the middle class, what we call the middle class tax cuts. Again, we propose to extend them. You can call that a tax cut or you can call it tax change, but the changes you refer to are a combination of limiting tax expenditures for the top 2% and allowing the rates for the top 2% to expire.
All right. So back to the question then. Let's, regardless of how we debate the definition of tax cuts and tax increases, if there are approximately $1.6 trillion of tax increases and the debt over 10 years is only being retired by $1.1 trillion, then it seems to me that the approach of the budget is to try to deal with the debt with revenue increases rather than spending restraint.
No, I think I would disagree with that. We propose a balance of spending restraint and tax changes to achieve that deficit reduction, much like the Commission did as a whole. In fact, I think if you look at the Commission recommendations on the tax side, they raise somewhat more revenue than we do, but not significantly more revenue than we do, just a little bit more revenue than we do in this context. But again, as you did in the Commission, we're proposing a comprehensive approach that looks at all the key drivers of these near-term deficits, the 5 to 10-year deficit.
Well, let me go back to the question I started out with you in my first round of questioning, and that is the notion of utilizing tax expenditures in this budget the way they are being utilized without achieving, in my opinion, much, if any, reform of either the corporate or the individual tax system. I'm very concerned about that, frankly, because it seems to me that if we do need to have major tax reform on both the individual and corporate side, and if we utilize the revenue from tax expenditures in the way the budget proposes, we take away significant potential for tax reform. And I'd just like you to address that question again.
Well, I think you're exactly right. There's two different strategies, choices we can make about how we think about tax reform. One is to change individual features, specific features of the current system, corporate and individual, to get a better balance of incentives, help bring down our deficits as a whole. The other is to do comprehensive reform that lowers rates, broadens base, and in that context, make sure we're meeting our long-term fiscal commitments. There are merits to both approaches. What we did in the budget, we did not propose comprehensive reform in a detailed way on corporate or individual in the budget. Absolutely. We didn't claim we were going to do that. What we did say is if we have to work within the current system, here's a set of changes which we think get the incentives better for investment, are more fair, and are consistent with our fiscal obligations. But I understand the case, as you've made in the past, for coming at this question through the path of comprehensive reform, because in that context, you can maybe have a better chance to make more substantial fundamental shifts in the tax code that would be better for incentives, better for growth, and more fair, more simple. And if we can find a way to do that, we'd welcome that.
Well, let me just say, I see my time's running out, or has run out, but let me just say, I believe the choice you have made in the budget significantly undercuts the opportunity for meaningful tax reform on both the corporate and the individual side, and I would just encourage you to evaluate that. And also, the President has said a number of times that he believes we need tax reform. I again believe, I want to state again to you publicly that I think that the President needs to get engaged and get out and lead on this issue. That's not to say that Congress doesn't need to be a part of that leadership as well, but we need the President engaged.
Senator, can I just respond on this one question?
Sure.
I agree with you, and as I said before, there is no credible path to tax reform that doesn't require the executive and Congress working together, and ultimately requires usually somebody in my job to lay out a set of proposals in this context. And I suspect that we're going to get to that point sooner on corporate than we will on individual, but we'll meet that challenge. Again, we're trying to figure out how to build consensus now on before we take that next step so that we maximize the chance that we get it done. But just one quick point. I think the virtue of what we did in the budget is to help people face more clearly what you can do within the current system and what you can't. And in many ways, for the reasons you're saying, showing people what you can do if you're constrained to operate within the current system might make people more interested in doing something comprehensive. Certainly on the corporate side, I think that's the case.
Well, I hope so. And as you know, it's my strong encouragement that we do move toward meaningful and comprehensive tax reform. Thank you.